Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Strauss's Arabella, which I saw at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. The conductor was Sir Donald Runnicles, the production was done by Tobias Kratzer, the sets and costumes were done by Rainer Zellmeyer, the assistant costume designer was Clara Luisa Hertel, the choreographer was Jeroen Verbruggen, the videographers were Manuel Braun and Jonas Dahl, the lights were handled by Stefan Woinke, the chorus master was Jeremy Bynes, and the dramaturgs were Bettina Bartz and Jörg Königsdorf. This production of Arabella has a rather interesting story behind it because Rachel Willis Sørensen, who was supposed to sing Arabella tonight, called in sick, so she couldn't make it to the premiere, thus supposedly having Gabriela Scherer sing the title role. However, Gabriela Scherer also called in sick, so who was left to sing Arabella? None other than Sara Jakubiak, with Gabriela Scherer singing Arabella for the next few performances. I will gladly talk about Sara Jakubiak later in this video, but first, my thoughts on the production. First of all, the production started off rather traditionally, as in the Waldner family and the fortune teller were in traditional costumes of the 19th century in Vienna, and it was set according to the libretto in a hotel. I did enjoy some of the filming that was done, especially by 3 camera people, but it was rather distracting as I was quite confused what was going on. But props to anybody who is already familiar with the story of Arabella to see what on earth is going on between the sisters and the parents, as well as what is going on with the servants, the people at the reception area, as well as the fortune teller getting a little bit more of a backstory, although she no longer has anything to sing after her scene with Adelaide and Zdenka. The first half of the ball was also set in a traditional style, although it was almost quite barren, with a purple wall and with 3 doormen, which I thought looked rather monotonous, and I would have loved to have a little bit more life and pomp, because after all, it is the ball that celebrates Arabella's transition into full-fledged womanhood, especially considering that Mandrika has become her Mr. Right, and there have been other suitors wanting her hand in marriage. But in terms of the ball scene, this is where things start to get more unusual. The scenography and the costumes transition from 19th century Vienna to the roaring 20s, especially considering that there are Nazis taking away somebody who is supposedly a Jew, as evidenced by somebody dressed in a gorilla costume to mock the Jews, and the Fiacre is initially dressed up as a man to demonstrate that this was the 1920s when women were starting to discover their sexuality and discover that their lives were not just in the kitchen, but they could do whatever they wanted and dress however they wanted. Then after the 1920s, we skip to the 1970s disco era, and finally the 2020s selfie / social media era, especially with Fiacre now as a social media star, filming all the things that are going on, even as she continues to sing her coloratura lines. And once the third act rolls, we are then treated to a bare stage with nearly everybody in either black or white. And there's even this huge screen showing Matteo and Zdenka consummating their feelings, as well as Zdenka confirming that, yeah, she likes being dressed as a man, not going back to her girlish ways because she feels more comfortable with her gender identity as well as her sex. And we also have this very confusing moment with Arabella, Zdenka, and all the people who are supposedly guests from the party, all sitting down and just inviting Adelaide, Mandrika, Matteo, and Count Waldner to just bask in their love, which was a very confusing moment. And there was also one shocking moment during Mandrika's and Matteo's supposed duel, which I suppose is Zdenka's imagination of everything that's unfolding, and she attempts to stop the duel only for her to supposedly end up shot, but it's revealed told that Zdenka has been self-harming as if to try to shock us, the viewers. So Zdenka harming herself was essentially shock to us viewers with almost little to no purpose whatsoever other than to be shocking. And also to show Zdenka as somebody who doesn't like herself, although she feels comfortable in being in boys' attire. And speaking of Zdenka preferring to be in boys' attire, this does defeat the purpose of Zdenka's metamorphosis later in the opera, where she reveals herself to be a girl. So it does contradict with what the libretto was stating. And this production of Arabella doesn't end with Mandrika and Arabella being intimate and cuddly with each other, but being completely hyperactive with each other, but with Matteo and Zdenka just being very cuddly with each other. So overall, I thought this production was disjointed, it was a mess, and the diegetic cohesiveness, as I like to call it, was completely all over the place. You have the first act that starts in the 19th century, and then later on in the opera, you transition into 1920s Germany or Austria during the Nazi regime, then followed by the 1970s disco era, and finally the 21st century selfie/social media era, and finally a barren stage, especially with Zdenka self-harming herself, all to be shocking. And as I stated before, a total mess through and through. I would have liked this production a lot more if it were traditionally set in the 19th century and if it were more consistent. But with the constant time jumps from 19th century Austria and the distracting filmmaking that was being used, which although was interesting and kind of developed the characters a little bit more in the first act, became a lot more distracting in the third act. Therefore, if you are hankering for a production of Arabella, I do not recommend this production by Tobias Kratza and his crew. However, if you are more open-minded and want to see it just because you want something a little bit more different than your usual production of Arabella, I might recommend it, but really hesitantly, because if you know me, I am not really a huge fan of Regietheater, because there are occasions in which Regietheater is shocking for the sake of being shocking, and the worst crime that Regietheater could ever commit, at least in my view, is pandering to the lowest common denominator. I mean, take a look at the extras and the characters using their phones for self-shots, as well as this whole gay and lesbian agenda going on, which is just, like I said before, shocking for the sake of being shocking. So for people who are hankering for a more traditional production of Arabella, I do not recommend this, but for those of you who want to give this production a go, I could recommend it if you're open-minded, but other than that, just try not to bother with this production at all. But if you're going to see this production of Arabella, just go for the singers, and let's start off with Sarah Jakubiak as Arabella. I heard a lot about this particular full lyric soprano who is now venturing into singing more spinto soprano roles, as she does boast a rather versatile repertoire from Mozart to her recent endeavors as Chrysothemis, Jenuffa, and an upcoming Sieglinde from Die Walküre. As I heard her tonight as Arabella, I did love that creamy, rich tone that she had, and I also enjoyed her fine top notes, which she sang with abandon. However, there were occasions in which I thought that her voice was masky and nasal at the beginning, but it did get better as the opera went on. But it's not just the initial maskiness and nasality which were caveats to her overall vocal performance, but also her insufficient chest tones, specifically evidenced when she sang Und du wirst mein Gebieter sein. And it also says something when an old school soprano, let alone a coloratura soprano, who was far more well known for her interpretation of Fiaccrimilli, Mimi Kurze, actually sang those chest tones when she sang Arabella much later in her career. Speaking of old school lyric sopranos / spinto sopranos who sang Arabella, the memories I have listening to the likes of Lotte Lehmann Eleanor Steber, Lisa de la Casa, Melita Museli, and Margareta Teschemacher can never ever be dissipated by any stretch of the imagination because those ladies had fine chest tones, great coordination between head voice and chest voice, and just an overall great technique that made Arabella the beauty that she was. And out of all the singers I mentioned, I especially loved Lotte Lehmann and Eleanor Steber because those two had exceptional techniques, especially when bringing out Arabella's transition into womanhood and also using those chest tones and great coordination between head voice and chest voice to make great vocal performances. With Sara Jakubiak, yes, she did have a nice tone. It was creamy, it was nice and rich, but it was lacking in head voice and chest voice coordination, which is the integral area that she needs to improve on. But other than that caveat, I thought that she got better throughout the opera, and she sounded a lot more present in the final act. Nevertheless, the issues that I had with Sara Jakubiak's voice, such as insufficient chest tones, nasality, maskiness, and insufficient coordination between head voice and chest voice cannot be ignored. And those are the areas that Miss Jakubiak needs to work on and improve on, because Miss Jakubiak does have great material to work with. She has material that spells loads of ambition, but if she really wants to get better, especially when it comes to remaining on stage for many years to come, she needs to address those problem areas, tackle them, and then she can definitely be a much better singer than she is. Because Sara Jakubiak does have all the potential to be a fine full lyric soprano. It's just that she needs to continuously work on her technique, as well as make sure that her voice remains in the right direction so that it can protect itself from any troubles to come, such as wobbles and tremolos and even caprinos that would have otherwise affected her fine performance of the evening. Speaking of vocal consistency, Elena Zalagova as Zdenka was easily the best performer of the evening. And that's saying something because I have seen Elena Zalagova go from strength to strength. From my first viewing of her as Pamina barely 10 years ago to seeing her as Micaela, Gilda, and a slew of wonderful roles appropriate for this light lyric soprano who also has the agility of a coloratura soprano, she definitely proved herself to be one of the finest singers I have ever heard live, and her vocal growth showed it tonight. Her voice rang throughout the theater, and she was able to give such a touching and elegant portrayal of Zdenka. Yes, I know I can never go wrong with the likes of Elfriede Trotschel, Hilde Guden, Annalisa Rothenberger, Lucia Popp, Edith Matis, Lieselotte Hammes, and even Lisa de la Casa before she sang Arabella. But Elena Zalagova was in a class of her own. She stood tall and proud as a very fine performer who was able to let her top notes ring, and the consistency that she has always maintained as a singer, as a singing actress, and as an overall performer was in full evidence in her performance as Zdenka. And it also helped that Elena Zalagova was really conscientious and cognizant with her choice of repertoire. She didn't take too heavy roles, and she really knew where her voice was going. And I definitely salute Elena Zalagova for a job superbly done as Zdenka. Her voice shone with brilliance and lustrousness, and her pristine technique shone like the brightest of diamonds and had that nice cut of titanium. So brava to Elena Zalagova for a job excellently done as Zdenka. Russell Brown was solid as Mandrika, although the memories I have with richer voices singing Mandrika, such as Hans Hotta, Herman Ude, and George London, can never ever be replicated, let alone be dissipated, because Hotta Ude and London had great techniques, excellent squealo, round and rich voices, which were really ideal for this particular character, and great techniques that made them very well known in the Heldenbariton and bass baritone repertoires. In terms of Russell Brown as Mandrika, yes, I was really fearful for him because he did spend most of his career as a lyric baritone, and now he's trying to have a go at more noble roles such as Posa from Don Carlo and especially Mandrika. And I thought that although he acted the part well, although his voice can sound masculine when it needed to be, there were times that I was not totally convinced of his overall vocal portrayal as Mandrika. There were occasions in which he sounded more like a tenor than an actual baritone, and his voice wasn't really that dark, round, and rich for Mandrika. But that's not to say that he was a bad singer, no way. His vocal presence was decent, and he was able to make Mandrika this roguish but ultimately human man who, although has a lot of money and a lot of social capital, is still a man first and foremost who is totally in love but is also very impulsive. And I thought that Russell Brown did portray those aspects of Mandrika well, although his voice is not one I would easily recommend for something like Mandrika. He'd be more at home singing roles like Rodrigo di Posa from Don Carlo and Ford from Falstaff if he develops his voice in the right way and uses more chest tones, because that's where all the magic and all that strength comes from in terms of being a true baritone. If Mr. Brown continues to work on his chest tones and develop his low notes well, then I'm pretty sure that he could tackle the greater baritone roles with ease. But in terms of his performance as Mandrika, while I do like his theatricality and while I do like his strong stage presence, I'm just not crazy about his vocal production because I feel like it could be a lot rounder, richer, and darker, and possess a lot more squealo. All caveats aside, I thought that Russell Brown was still able to be committed to the role of Mandrika, thus making him not as this boorish rich man who has a pretty impulsive way of going around things, but a passionate and impulsive man who does have some human qualities to him. So I still have to give him his props for what he was able to do with Mandrika. Robert Watson also stole the show as Matteo, especially among the male singers. I definitely loved how he was able to lunge at his high notes as well as maintain such a virile, strong, and handsome full lyric tenor quality to his voice that could also sing spinto tenor roles if he continues to develop his technique in the right way. There's a fullness to Robert Watson's voice that I really enjoy and really love because he can sing lyrically, he can sing explosively and dramatically, and do so with consistency and with virile charm, which he managed to accomplish so well. There was not one moment where I thought that he was wobbly, and there was not one moment where I thought he was inaudible. In fact, he sang over that orchestra with everything that he's got, and he had the guts and the stamina to power through the evening, which made him quite the formidable force tonight. And while I believe he can never beat out the likes of Helge Roswenge or Rudolf Schock when it comes to all of these strong sword-like tenor roles, let alone that tenor vocality, I still think that Robert Watson was in a class of his own in terms of being fully committed as a singing actor, as well as being consistent with his technique. And here's also hoping that he continues not only to stay consistent with his really good technique, but also be conscientious and cognizant with his choice of roles. Because I do see a nice future for Robert Watson, especially in the fuller lyric tenor / spinto tenor roles. I do not really see him singing Tristan or Tannhäuser because that would have been vocal suicide, but I do see him in roles such as Walter von Stolzing, Idomeneo, as well as Lohengrin from, of course, Wagner's Lohengrin. That's where I feel like his voice could very well end up going. Oh, and lest I forget about Carlo from I Masnadieri, as well as Arvino and Oronte from I Lombardi alla prima crociata. Whether Italian, German, French, Russian, Czech, or English, or any other language in opera, I can definitely see Robert Watson continue to go from strength to strength, and he definitely proved it in his performance as Matteo. Albert Pesendorfer was a strong and powerful Graf Theodor Waldner. With his trademark basso profondo voice, he was able to give this patriarch strong vocal presence as well as that virility that I love in many a basso profondo. And he definitely made the best out of this patriarch, and it was such an exciting experience to see and hear him sing the absolute heck out of this patriarch. And it's all thanks to his rock-solid technique that he was able to create such a strong characterization with Graf Theodor Waldner. Singing by his side as his wife, Gräfin Adelaide Waldner, is the veteran mezzo-soprano Doris Zoffel. And my goodness, was she able to sing up a storm as this matriarch. Her technique was sterling as always, and she was definitely using that steely mezzo-soprano voice of hers to sing up a storm throughout the evening, and that strong technique of hers managed to keep her on stage for many years to come. And it's also quite astonishing to know that she's in her 70s and she still sings as gloriously as ever, all thanks to how she was able to keep her technique rock steady and solid all the way through. There was not one problem that I thought that her voice was going to give way. She didn't sound wobbly. She didn't sound like there was something about to disappear from her voice. In fact, she sounded steely all the way through. I do kind of miss steelier mezzo-sopranos such as Ira Malaniuk and even Elisabeth Hüngen, let alone Helga Dernesch when she sang this role in the 80s. But with what Doris Zoffel had to offer as Gräfin Adelaide Waldner, she offered with beauty, strength, gutsiness, and a whole lot of valor, thus showing that she was truly a stage and vocal animal from beginning to end. And I salute her for all of her efforts, as well as the strong chemistry that she had with Albert Pesendorfer as Graf Theodor Waldner. Alexandra Hutton may have sung the role of the fortune teller well, but I kind of thought that her light lyric soprano voice was ill-fitting for this older woman character, considering that I always associate the fortune teller with dramatic mezzo-sopranos or dramatic sopranos late in their career. Alexandra Hutton's voice is just way too lovely and way too luscious for something like the fortune teller, but that is not to discredit her talents as a singing actress. In fact, she acted and sang the absolute heck out of this part with her fine technique, gorgeous silvery lyric soprano voice, although if you ask me, I prefer it when a chesty mezzo-soprano sings the role of the fortune teller. And you also wonder why I love singers like Elisabeth Hüngen and Martha Mörtel in that particular role. Oh, and lest I forget about Reinhild Runkel, who also recorded the role of the fortune teller. So these steelier mezzo-soprano voices are what I think are more ideal for the role of the fortune teller, rather than someone like Alexandra Hutton, who has this lovely light lyric soprano voice, which she used to excellent greatness, and her stage presence was absolutely commanding. So while Alexandra Hutton's silvery light lyric soprano voice is not one that I would easily associate with the fortune tellers, I could still give her credit for what she was able to do with making this otherwise thankless character be someone to root for, as well as someone to be thoroughly invested in. Thomas Blondella sang a whole lot better as Count Elema in stark comparison to his Herodes from Salome, because this role was a lot more lyrical and it was far more suitable for his lyric tenor voice. Yes, there were times that his top notes were kind of compromised, but what he had was a fine, full lyric tenor voice that managed to make the best out of Elema, and he did so with abandon and charm, although there were occasions in which he ducked his top notes, but that's an otherwise small price to pay for what was otherwise a fine vocal performance and a role that really did fit Thomas Blondel like a glove because of his full lyric tenor voice being put to fabulous use. Kyle Miller was a handsomely sung Count Dominic, all thanks to his lyric baritone voice, and he also had a fine stage presence that made the best out of this particular suitor for Arabella. And I'm pretty sure that once he continues to develop his technique in the right way, he will definitely rise to new heights with roles such as Posa from Don Carlo, Ford from Falstaff, Chonal from La Boheme, and even Sharpless from Madama Butterfly. The future possibilities for this fine young lyric baritone are absolutely endless, and here's also hoping that he continues to strengthen his technique. Tyler Zimmerman did show sufficient virility and charm as Count Lamoral, all thanks to his fine bass baritone voice, which sounds more baritonal in quality, but his charismatic stage presence managed to make the best out of one of Arabella's suitors. He was sufficiently tall and handsome on stage, and I'm also sure that if he continues to develop those chest tones well, he will definitely be a stronger singer. So here's also hoping that Tyler Zimmerman does not squander his talents, let alone his technique, and here's also hoping that he will go from strength to strength. I was quite excited to see Hye-Young Moon as the Fiakermilli. I've been wanting to see her as the Queen of the Night, but that performance of Zauberflöte was sold out, so here was the other chance to see Miss Moon as the Fiakermilli. And she had a darlingly sweet stage presence. She managed to apply her lovely and minute figure to embody the Fiakermilli's minxishness that made Fiakermilli, whether she was dressed as a 1920s dancer / entertainer or a 2020 social media star, she was able to play the role of the Fiakermilli and even sing the absolute heck out of Fiakermilli with everything that she's got. Yes, her voice is on the smallish side, but it is otherwise a lovely instrument that has a certain sweetness to it, and her voice did get better as the evening went on. And yes, there have been greater Fiakermillis such as Mimi Kurze, who is my absolute favorite in that role, Jeanette Scavotti, who actually is better than Mimi Kurze as the Fiakermilli because she did have that fullness in her voice. And lest I forget about Hildegard Uhrmacher, who was also quite well known for not only singing the Fiakermilli, but also the classic coloratura soprano roles of Lucia della Mermur and the Queen of the Night. And of course, that one coloratura soprano who, in my opinion, stands head to toe with Mimi Kurze, Jeanette Scavotti, and Hildegard Uhrmacher, Roberta Peters, because of her darling vocal technique as well as that perennial youthfulness that she had in singing roles like the Fiakermilli and even Sabinetta. With Hye-Young Moon, she did have a very pleasant sounding voice that was sweet and well emitted, and it had that luscious quality that I love in many a soprano leggero singing the Fiakermilli. But I would love to hear her voice develop in the right way and not in a way that would make her top notes shriller, let alone thinner. Because while I did like the color of her voice, there were occasions in which some of her top notes sounded thin and shrill, but that's otherwise a small price to pay for what was otherwise a charming, sweet, charismatic, and totally fun portrayal of the Fiakermilli. In fact, if Hye-Young Moon continues to develop her technique in the right way, I can definitely hear her and see her in roles such as Oscar from Un Bal in Maschera, Nanetta from Falstaff, Gilda from Rigoletto, Olympia from Le Comte of Man, Lakmé from Lakmé, Dinora Urbain from Les Huguenots, The Fire and the Princess from L'Enfant et le Sortilège, Leila from Le Pêcheur de Perles, Blanchen from Die Entführung aus dem Serail, and even Ilia from Idomeneo, and in probably 5 or 10 years' time, Fiordiligi from Così fan tutte. The possibilities for this young coloratura soprano are absolutely endless. Oh, unless I forget about Sebinetta and Aminta. Those are roles that will definitely fit Hye-Young Moon like a glove. But in terms of her portrayal as the Fiacremili, yes, Hye-Young Moon did have some thin and rather shrill top notes. But when there were times that she had to hit those additional top notes, she did so with sweet abandon and she did so with commitment. So this was definitely a committed soprano leggero. I would love to see her career grow and grow because the potential is there. And here's also hoping that Miss Moon will continue to enrich her technique as well as strengthen her repertoire. There were also some fine performances from Jörg Schirner as Velko, Michael Jamak as Dura, Robert Hebenstreit as Jankel, Tyson Rusch as the waiter, and even Silke Brill, Lea Hopp, and Janitz Baby as the camera team. So overall, the singing was quite decent through and through, with the standouts being Elena Zalagova and Robert Watson as Zdenka and Matteo respectively. I also have to give mad props to Albert Pesendorfer for his powerfully sung Count Waldner, as well as Doris Soffel singing up an absolute storm as Countess Adelaide Waldner. Their vocal chemistry as the parents was absolutely superb. And even though I did have my issues with Sara Jakubiak as Arabella and Russell Brown as Mandrika, they were still able to be committed to their craft as singing actors, and they were able to do fine jobs with their respective roles. And in terms of the character parts, Alexandra Hutton actually stood head and shoulders above the smaller players with her sterling technique, although her lovely, silvery, light lyric soprano voice is not one that I would easily associate with the role of the fortune teller. Hence why I believe that the role of fortune teller may as well be casted to a mezzo-soprano or a low dramatic soprano late in her career. Unless I forget about the equally fine singing accomplished by Thomas Blondel as Count Elema, Kyle Miller as Count Dominic, and Tyler Zimmerman as Count Lamoral, and of course, Hye-Young Moon being an absolute darling as the Fiacremili. The conducting done by Sir Donald Runnicles was great all throughout. He kept the orchestra going and moving and flowing well, and he also made sure that the orchestra supported the singers. The chorus and orchestra of the Deutsche Oper Berlin are always reliable and always ready, and even though the production is not really to my liking, I still have to give some props to the extras for at least keeping the evening as interesting and as not boring as possible. So at least I can give them that. Although Tobias Kratza and his team should have been a lot more consistent with their vision of Arabella rather than just going all over the place with it. So overall, while the production suffers from inconsistency and disjointedness, as well as being quite a mess in terms of diegesis, I still have to give some props to the singers for pulling through, especially Elena Zalagova and her sterling technique, making such great use of Zdenka's music, and Robert Watson being an absolutely sturdy tenor who managed to make the best out of Matteo. And I also have to give my props to Sara Jakubiak for doing a fine job as Arabella, and here's also hoping that she continues to develop her voice in the right way. Russell Brown for his commitment as Mandrika, Alexandra Hutton and her charming fortune teller, Albert Pesendorfer and Doris Soffel singing up a storm as the parents, Thomas Blondel, Kyle Miller, and Tyler Zimmerman being fine as the three suitors of Arabella, and Hye-Young Moon being girlish, charming, kittenish, and quite vivacious as the Fiacremili. And for those of you who caught this production of Strauss's Arabella, what did you think of it? Did you really like the production, or did you not care for it at all? Was there a singer you particularly loved, whether it be Elena Zalagova, Robert Watson, Sara Jakubiak, Russell Brown, Doris Soffel, Albert Pesendorfer, Thomas Blondel, Kyle Miller, Tyler Zimmerman, or Hye-Young Moon, let alone Alexandra Hutton? Or did you feel that the production and the singing were not to your liking, let alone not up to par? Please comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Strauss's Arabella at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. Tune in next time for my review of, again, Strauss's Arabella, but this time with Gabriela Schira as the title heroine. So until then, good night, everybody.